Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, one of 36,000 Rotary clubs around the world, 1.2 million people dedicated to the idea of service above self, as in what can we do to make our communities better locally, globally, and in our case, digitally, right? And so our hope every week is to bring people to you who can give you new ways of thinking about the world, how we can make a difference in small ways, in grand ways. And in terms of grand ways of making the world better, we have a gem of a speaker for us today. Samantha Deane is a person whose personal story I hope certainly intrigued you as you were reading it coming into the recording on our meeting page. She spent time in the financial world. She spent time in kind of an international project that was linking the UK and Dubai. If I have that right. Samantha, do I have that right, or was it a different company? No, it's London, right? London and Dubai.
Yeah.
She's like, that's right. Good. Excellent. And now she's part of a Save the World effort that I am excited for us to pass along to you. It has to do with kelp. And if you've never thought of the power of kelp to save the world, after today, you will. Samantha, it is an honor for us to be able to share your story. We're honored to have you with us, and I hand the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Rushton. It is a real honor for me to be here presenting to the Rotary E-Club Silicon Valley. I am coming to you from The Hague in the Netherlands, where there is no giant kelp forest. I think you're closer to giant kelp forest than I am. But I wanted to tell you about an innovation that could be one of the most exciting, scalable and sustainable nature-based solutions that we have in our doorstep and our capacity to do, which could help mitigate not only climate change, but also add quite a lot of benefits on a socio-economic side with employment and with wealth creation, but also with nature-friendly products that could in turn also avoid emissions. So I am the MD of the Kelp Forest Foundation. On the right, on the photos, you see what a wild kelp forest could look like. Some of the divers diving there call it kelp cathedrals. They can grow up to 65 meters and they look like, yeah, beautiful underwater rainforests. They are amazing in terms of 3D environment. They create shelter, food, and habitat for hundreds of species. So today's discussions, I want to quickly go through who we are, why we're focusing on giant kelp, macrocystis it's called. How does kelp really sequester carbon, which is one of the ecosystem services? How is kelp really related to innovation? What are the challenges we are facing when we're trying to look at scaling this and researching this innovation? And just a few words of conclusion. So the Kelp Forest Foundation, we have a mission of really filling the gaps in the science around giant kelp cultivation. There is no science because this is an innovation. The inspiration for both the innovation company, which is called Kelp Blue, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, and the Kelp Forest Foundation was a famous scientist called Tim Flannery. He has been talking about the power of kelp forest for many years as a solution to a myriad of problems that we have. One of them is excess CO2, but biodiversity loss is the same side of the coin when we're talking about climate change and the ocean. And the other one is Daniel Hooft, who is the innovator. He is the one who took the challenge that Tim Flannery talked about, which was scaling up the power of kelp forests. And he thought of doing it to do it at scale, you have to go offshore. Daniel is an ex-Shell offshore engineer, so he was on the dark side, but he is using his offshore engineer skills to set up these platforms that will create the foundation for offshore giant kelp forests. The Kelp Forest Foundation was set up to fund the research that needs to be underpinning the claims of this type of seaweed cultivation, the methodology that will help to create carbon credits for the sector as a whole, the creation of seed banks where we will keep these seeds for the future generation for conservation research efforts and also future kelp farmers, ocean education and capacity building, and also creating awareness, a bit like what I'm doing today, about the ecological benefits of growing kelp forests, restoring them, and also cultivating them. Our research program is based mainly on carbon sequestration and biodiversity, but we also look at the impact of the kelp-based products. One of them, for example, is biostimulants, which are hopefully going to replace, at least in part, chemical fertilizers. So why do we focus on giant kelp? This is a bit of a very quick overview of the world of seaweed. So seaweed is a type of algae. You have micro and you have macro algae, and the seaweeds are the marine macro algae, so the ones that grow in the sea. And within the seaweeds, you have brown, you have red, and you have green seaweeds. And giant kelp is a brown seaweed. And you also have different types of kelp. So when people talk about kelps, not all kelps are the same. And a lot of the kelp that is grown, 98% in fact, is grown in Southeast Asia. Only 2% is grown in the West. And most of it has to do with food and some of it with alginates, which then go help make bioplastics, for example. So giant kelp is a very small species within a very big world of algae. The special thing about giant kelp, and one that not many people know, is the fastest growing organism on the planet. So it is battling that first post with bamboo, which is why sometimes giant kelp is being called the scoria of the oceans or the bamboo of the oceans, because it can grow up to 50 centimeters per day. And as I showed you in the first image, these kelp cathedrals of up to 65 meters. So very similar to terrestrial land forests, it needs a lot of, it creates photosynthesis. With photosynthesis, it grows in a very, very fast manner. But a terrestrial forest will take 20, 30 years to grow. A giant kelp forest will only take one season to grow, which is about 7 to 8 months. It is naturally buoyant because of those cysts, these air bladders, and that makes it create a canopy, which also adds to its photosynthesis properties. It grows in forests. It supports hundreds of species, from the very small to the very big. And not only that, but when harvested, it does have very many high value compounds. The ecosystem services of kelp forests, cultivated and wild, are many. Carbon capture, as I mentioned, biodiversity enhancement. It also filters water, so it takes up a lot of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, for example, to grow. So sometimes they're used for bioremediation. And they also, because they're sequestering so much CO2, and in exchange they are releasing oxygen, they deacidify the waters around them in a halo effect. So how does kelp sequester carbon? So unlike plants, kelp does not have a root. It has a holdfast, and it tends to grow in rocky surfaces. So the carbon sequestration actually happens way away from the kelp forest. It happens in deep ocean through particulate organic carbon, so small pieces of the kelp that are either dissolved in the water or ends up in the sediments below the 1,000-meter level. In terms of competing with numbers, you can see that the giant kelp, because it's growing so fast, it is actually absorbing a hell of an amount of carbon into its biomass, which it keeps using to grow. And this is very different to, for example, even the Amazon tropical rainforest. That's why they say that the marine ecosystems can sequester about 20 times more than the Amazon rainforest. So how does kelp tie in with Silicon Valley and innovation and the exciting new possibilities? So Kelp Blue is, as I mentioned, the company that Daniel Holt set up in the middle of Corona. And basically what he is doing with the company is creating these structures, which will then be seeded with seed that has been created in the hatchery, in the land-based kind of nursery, if you want, the same way as a farm would be doing it. And then the kelp would, with its holdfast, grab onto these ropes, and then it grows towards the surface. This will be placed about 15 meters from the sea surface. Where this type, because it's floating, is not, it can be put outside the small coastal areas, which means that it can be much bigger surfaces than if you were dependent on nearshore small coves. So this type of innovation can be expanded to other areas in the world where giant kelp is present, namely the southern coast of Africa, the southern coast of Latin America, the west coast of the US, Tasmania, and New Zealand. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of square kilometers of potential expansion. In terms of products, we only know about 30% of the uses that today that can be done from kelp. The main one that Kelp Blue is focusing on is biostimulants, which is a sort of natural replacement for chemical fertilizers, which has a myriad of benefits in the soil, but also avoiding those chemical runoffs into lakes and rivers that create algae blooms and dead zones. You can also keep on extracting other molecules like the alginates, which will help in biopackaging, in textiles, in food thickeners, but you also have other properties for pharmaceuticals that are antiviral, anti-cancer, and food additives that could be given to a myriad of animals between cows and pigs and fish. And it could be a way of stopping the kind of feeding illness that we have, where we catch wild fish to make fish meal to give to cultivated fish, for example. We undertake quite a lot of research around the kelp forest to see how we quantify the ecosystem services, and we are always encountering, quite a few unlikely challenges that you wouldn't find that in other places in the world. This is namely in Namibia. The weather patterns are difficult. There's a lot of wind in Namibia where this farm is grown. That's why they hold the World Championship in windsurf there. You need like 5 different permits when you want to go into the different research areas, because there is a lot of diamond mining in Namibia. So all of these different concessions, you have to ask for permits. The ocean tech is way behind land-based tech. So, and because you're in a marine saline environment, it has a lot of other issues like biofouling and needs constant recalibration. You have to get into a boat to look at it. The battery life is short, and the cost is super high. So one sensor can cost anything between $30,000 and $50,000 just for one parameter. I find sometimes difficult to find out who's doing what in the research. So I find that research institutions are working very much in silos. So it takes a lot of energy and effort to find out who the specialists are in different areas. And of course, research is never cheap, especially not in the marine environment. So we set up this foundation because we do believe that the whole industry needs to have their claims underpinned by robust science. And this will help the sector as a whole. And if we help the sector, then we are also helping the impact of this type of nature-based solution towards the ocean. So we still need to be investing in this research, in the types of products that can be made out of kelp, and ocean tech, and other innovative monitoring techniques to be able to quantify the ecosystem services. So that is my presentation, and I would love to have questions from all of you.
You will get questions from us, that's for sure. I've got a good list myself. Before we get to the questions, I'd like to introduce those who are joining us for the recording today. To all of our members and guests, one of the benefits of joining us for a recording is that not only do you get to ask your questions, but when the speaker has time after the recording, we can keep talking to these fascinating people that we connect with. So joining us from Maryland is John Tra, who is the founder of the Quinny project. It is an effort in West Africa to do all sorts of good for kids there. Chanel Reed, who is in Atlanta. Chanel she works with Activian, a company that facilitates organ donorship. She's with the Vinings Columbia Rotary Club. My program discussion colleague from the Rotary Club of Eugene Metropolitan, Heather Edwards, who is currently in Tlaquepaque, Mexico. And so we are glad to have all three of you with us. My name is Rushton Hurley. I am the charter president of the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley and the guy who's lucky enough to be the programs director as well. So I get to talk to all these people. With that, Samantha, I want to start with a question from Chanel. How did your organization discover that kelp was so important? You mentioned the Australian scientist whose ideas sparked Daniel Hoft, but I'm guessing that because you've set up your foundation, you have really begun to ramp up the kinds of things that has been learned about kelp. Is that something you can speak to about really kind of going from, hey, this is promising, to, oh my goodness, look how promising this is?
I think it's like anything in life, the more you get to know about it, well, some things in life, some are not like that. With kelp, it was, at the beginning, it was like, not sure about this. And then the more you learn about it, the more research you look into, the more scientists and people you speak to, the more you realize that it is really an enormous untapped potential that we have in our oceans. And giant kelp, especially because it has so many beautiful properties, that is not just that it grows fast and sequesters CO2, but it does create these amazing ecosystems. So you're benefiting the ocean and the coastal communities in many other ways than just products. So yes, it was a journey of discovery, and one that I only get more and more in love with kelp every day.
Wonderful. Matter of fact, speaking of journeys, can I get you to go back to the slide that includes the map of the world? Essentially, when you showed us that slide, what struck me, yes, perfect. I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, that's a lot of different latitudes, right? Does that mean that kelp is just the kind of organism that can grow in a lot of different latitudes, or is it that there's so many different kinds of kelp that that by being able to harvest kelp in in the Arctic Circle, you're getting something just as useful as you would in tropical areas?
Yeah, good question. So below here, you see different types of seaweed, different type of kelp, and different types of kelp will grow in different places. And different types of kelp, some of them, kelp is really not a scientific name. That bunches of, a lot of brown macroalgae, which means that the difference between one kelp and another will be enormous. So the thick gray line will be reflecting where giant kelp grows at the moment. And it does grow in many areas. It goes, in the West, in the US, it goes from Baja California all the way to Alaska, for example. But it does like cold temperate waters. So in areas like Tasmania, for example, where you do have giant kelp, I'm afraid because of the warming of waters, you're seeing quite a lot of that kelp dying. So areas here will be other types of kelp that can be grown, which is not giant kelp. So yes, but there is, in terms of surface area, there's a lot of area where giant kelp is present and can be grown.
Gotcha. So I think that actually leads well to a question from John, when he's asking about how far from the coast these farms can be located. Is it the case, for example, that sea traffic disturbs the farms in some particular way, and you have to account for that? What kind of thinking goes into where the farms can go?
Good questions. So obviously you could be growing in the middle of the ocean, somewhere like here. The problem is that if you are wanting to then harvest it, traveling to and from is a big issue. That's one thing, is the distance. The distance has to be reasonable, so to be able to then harvest and bring back to land, because that's where the product will be made and sent. The other issue is licenses. The ocean in these areas, there are no licenses, so it would be much easier to, in a way, farm that bit of the ocean if you didn't have that distance issue. But within most of the countries have the EEZ zone, which is within 200 nautical miles from the coast. So that's where it would be making it more easier to get, to be able to discuss with a government to get the permit to be able to farm this. Because of course you don't buy a piece of the ocean, you only get licenses, and the licenses come from governments. And sometimes you have governments and states and places like Australia and New Zealand, you might also, and the same with Alaska, you might also have to be talking to the First Nation people. So there's a lot of stakeholder management as well as government management that has to be discussed. In terms of where you located the farm, you obviously have a lot of other uses in the ocean. So you have, other kind of farmers, be it mussel farmers or fish farmers. You also have the fishermen. You also have the lines where the ships come. You also have maybe migratory lines that shouldn't be crossed by, for the whales. So placing the farm will have to take into account all of these things. And that will determine at exactly what level, whether it is 4 kilometers near the shore or is it 10. The good thing about being 4 to 10 kilometers offshore, for example, is that the competition for that space is much, much less than if you were in the nearshore areas. Because in the nearshore areas, we will have, other types of users that are making that area quite busy.
Got it.
And hence why you can make it much more scalable. You can make much bigger farms there.
All right. So actually, along those same lines, I don't know. I don't know what distance from shore factors are in play with regard to offshore wind farming, right? But I was thinking about the slide where you are showing the system that Hof designed to create these nets. Perfect. And actually, a very basic question: Does kelp grow up like a tree trunk or down like tree roots, right? And I'm sure that kind of factors into thinking about how these things can work.
Yeah. So kelp, because it has these cysts, and that's why it's called macrocystis peripheria. The cysts, the air bladders, they make them buoyant, so they go upwards, and then they create these canopies at the top. So hence why that facilitates the harvesting, because all you have to harvest is that, a bit like you were mowing the lawn, you would just harvest the top 10% and leave the rest of the 15 meters in the water to continue with its ecosystem services undisturbed. You just need to harvest the top bit, as opposed to other types of kelp, for example, laminaria, which it grows downwards and it's in the water 5 to 6 months, and then the whole line gets taken up for harvesting. So your ecosystem services only last for that amount of time, this is completely different, because giant kelp is a perennial species. So you seed it once, and then it can grow 7 to 20 years.
Okay, that leads us to a question from Heather about when kelp dies. I'm hoping I'm using the term properly, but and say settles on the ocean floor, maybe does that risk release of sequestered carbon, kind of like when trees get cut down?
So it very much depends where the detritus, which is the dead kelp, ends up. If the detritus ends up in the sediments, in areas that are deep ocean, like 1,000 meters or below. I don't know if you've seen the boat, the Endurance, that was found a few months ago. It was intact. Why? Because those areas that are really deep ocean are anoxic. There is no oxygen, which means that it doesn't, easily come back to the surface. So scientists talk about the area that is 1,000 meters below the sea surface or below that as areas which would sequester any carbon of any sort for more than 100 years. And that's why you would call that sequestration rather than just absorption of the carbon. So only about 11% of the detritus will end up in this situation. The rest will be remineralized and be re-released, or will be fed, urchins will eat it, or fish will eat it, or will end up released again into the atmosphere.
Okay, and returning to an idea that I started on and then sidetracked myself, I've got a talent for that, and that is offshore wind farming. The platforms that are required to be put in, or I guess they're not platforms in a sense, but is there something about the construction of offshore wind farming that represents an opportunity for combining efforts related to kelp farming so that it kind of reduces overhead in some productive way?
Yeah, it does. It is being something that is being looked into here in Holland. In the North Sea, there is pilot projects happening here with some seaweed farmers, where they're looking at putting lines in between the windmills, the wind parks. So that is definitely something that needs to be looked into much more. And that would obviously be making a good use of that infrastructure as well. In Namibia, there is the nascent industry, but it's very much on the land and it's not necessarily in the water. But the other thing you have to look at is the places where these wind parks are placed. Is it got the same nutritional upwelling benefit than other areas? So the fact that there is a wind park there doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best place for a seaweed farm.
That makes sense. So one more question before we wind things down for the recording. You were born in Argentina, and so you were there. You went to university to study law and economics at Durham University in the United Kingdom. Is there something about your early years that planted seeds that got you into this place where you're like, I could be part of an effort that addresses climate change in some really big way? I mean, are there particular pieces of your youth that you think were important for getting you into a mindset that allows you to be someone who thinks the way you do?
I think it was my first discovery of what happens underneath the surface of the ocean. That was a real aha moment for me. I was about 8 or 9 and we were in Brazil. And I did my first diving experience. And it wasn't with a big tank because I was too small for that. I had a big tube that connected to a tank on the boat. And then suddenly I saw what I'd never seen before, which was this magical underwater life that was happening, like a parallel universe to what my childhood had been on land, on a horse, on the Pampas. So that was like, oh my God, there's a whole world underwater that we are not even knowing about it, and it's happening at the same time. It was a bit like a metaverse kind of moment. And I think in later years it was, yes, of course, there is a whole ocean that covers 70% of our planet, and we are only up to now been using it for shipping lanes or extracting by fishing and mining. There is a way of working with this ocean where we give back to the ocean while also benefiting from it. And I think that combination was a couple of aha moments. And yeah, I wanted to stop regurgitating paper and actually having an impact that would benefit my children and their offspring eventually. So
inspiring. That's wonderful. May I ask you to go back to your final slide as we handle logistics so that people know how to contact you if they want to talk further about the work being done by the Kelp Forest Foundation. To all of our guests, those of you who are watching this recording as a function of having been having had the YouTube link shared with you, or because you are attending our weekly meeting, those of you who are asking about, like, what is this meeting thing you're talking about? So our Rotary Club is not only online, it's asynchronous. So our members can attend the meeting anytime between Monday morning and Sunday night. We interact with each other via online forums, via online socials, via one-to-one connections that we do with what we call Coffee with a Rotarian. Shout out to Tviatko for having started that. And if I have that wrong, shout out to whoever did. But we love the opportunity that we have to share inspiring stories. So however you made it to us, thank you. And I hope you will let us know that you were here. So if you are on our page, scroll down a little bit farther, you'll see an attendance form. Just put in your name, your email address. We won't share it with scummy, spammy people or anything like that. What we want to do is just be able to help generate an email that you can use, Rotarians, with the secretary at your own club to make up for a missed meeting. If you are working to be a 100% attender in order to get that regular inspiration that comes from the Rotary world. And then finally, at the bottom, there is our forum, the discuss section, DIS, QUS. And there you can leave thoughts that you have about the meeting, the different elements of the meeting, the program itself, thoughts for Samantha. You can reply to other comments, like them, whatever floateth your boat. So as we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. And so Samantha, thank you again for a wildly cool presentation, and I'm excited to have you take us home.
Yeah, my last thought is that, we do have 1,000 problems out there, but we do have 10,000 solutions. And it's just a question of focusing on the solutions that are readily available today. And kelp forest cultivation is one of those solutions that could be benefiting not only the ocean and biodiversity, but also socioeconomically creating employment and products that are also going to be helping the planet. So let's focus on those solutions for our children and for future generations so that they can be proud of us too.
Excellent. Everyone, we will see you next week.